What took place in an elegant villa by Lake Wannsee was no ordinary meeting. It was the prelude to the largest bureaucratically organized crime in human history. 15 men, educated, dressed in suits with titles and official positions, sat around a table not to discuss a war or military strategy, but to coordinate the systematic murder of millions of people. Between cups of coffee and cigarettes, they drafted the disappearance of entire communities with a language as cold as it was calculated. There were no screams, no blood, no weapons, only records, protocols, and euphemisms. While families were deported, while children were separated from their mothers, they spoke of quotas, trains, and final solutions. The brutality wasn't improvised. It was designed, adjusted, and executed from offices, well lit. The machinery of extermination worked tirelessly, protected by Hitler's silence, Eichmann's efficiency, Heydrich's deadly ambiguity, and the collaboration of an entire elite. This was not a spontaneous tragedy, but a crime planned with morbid precision. And it all began at Wannsee. Of the marginalization to the extermination, origin of the solution final. From the moment the Nazis seized power in January 1933, it was clear that Jews would be excluded from German public life. Throughout the first years of the regime, he issued decrees, and they promoted laws that they had their basic rights taken away, the moved away of the employment state, and reduced his stake in the economy, culture, and the educational system. This marginalization, however, was not the ultimate goal, but a path toward a solution further drastic. Regime of Hitler. No had a plan established from the beginning, but rather advanced by stages, adapting their methods to internal and external circumstances. In the early years, forced emigration was strongly promoted as shape of clean Germany, and thousands of Jews were pushed to leave the country, leaving behind properties and family networks. Between 1933 and 1939, there was an acceleration of these policies. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, enacted in April 1933, was one of the first measures which excluded Jews from the state apparatus. This was followed by others, such as the law of citizenship of the Reich, which stripped them of their German nationality. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 prohibited the marriages between Jews and no-Jews, and they legally defined who should be considered Jewish based on racial criteria. These regulations not only institutionalized discrimination, but also created a legal basis for future systematic persecution. Exclusion shifted from economic and professional to biological and racial. In this process, propaganda played a crucial role, fueling anti-Semitism and preparing the population for more extreme measures. Towards the end of the decade, the international situation also influenced the regime's decisions. The annexation of Austria in 1938 and the occupation of the Sudetenland that same year added thousands of Jews to the controlled territories. By Reich, to extent that as the territory under German rule expanded, so did the problem as the Nazis saw it, the so-called Jewish question. Kristallnacht in November of 1938 frame a change important. Miles' businesses and synagogues were destroyed, hundreds of people were arrested and deported, and it became clear that physical violence against Jews already was part of the official policy. It was no longer just about expelling them, but also intimidating them, making their life in Germany impossible, and preparing the ground for more radical solutions. With the outbreak of the war in 1939, the situation changed dramatically. The conquest of Poland brought millions of Jews under German control, many of them in precarious living conditions. The Nazi administration was faced with what they considered Jewish overpopulation in the new territories. In this context, ghettos began to be established as a way to physically isolate the Jewish population, concentrate it, and make it more controllable. The Lodz ghetto was one of the first, followed by many others in cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, and Lublin. The conditions of these spaces were extremely harsh. Hunger, disease, and overcrowding were constant. Ghettoization was not a temporary solution, but rather an intermediate step toward more organized extermination plans. In parallel, the Nazi authorities began to explore different forms of treat it, which they continued to call the Jewish question. Initially, territorial solutions were considered. Between Ari, highlighted he called Plan Madagascar that proposed deport to European Jews to that island under French rule. However, the advance of the war and British resistance made this project unviable. Even so, the idea of a massive relocation remained present in official discourse for some time. In reality, this rhetoric served to mask the regime's true intentions, which were increasingly leaning toward physical elimination. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1940 marked a definitive turning point. From the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, special SS units known as Einsatzgruppen began executing large groups of Jews in the occupied territories. These units, supported by the regular army and local collaborators, carried out mass shootings in forests, ravines, and areas far from urban centers. In cities such as Kiev, Minsk, or in Riga, thousands of people were systematically murdered. At Babin Yar, for example, more than 30,000 Jews were shot in a matter of days. These massacres were not improvised acts, but planned operations supported by logistics and political at the highest level. As these executions multiplied, it became clear that physical elimination was no longer an exceptional measure. Although the methods were rudimentary and caused great wear and tear between the own perpetrators, the aim was clear: reduce drastically the Jewish presence in the East. The idea of an evacuation to the East, frequently mentioned in official documents, served as a cover for these massacres. In many cases, the victims were forced to dig their own graves before being shot. Survivor testimonies and evidence collected after the war showed that these actions were carried out with knowledge and approval of the Nazi High Command. The extermination had started before of that existed a formal and centralized decision like the one that would be made later. In parallel, the ideological foundations that would justify genocide were being developed. For Nazi ideologues, Jews were not just a social or political problem, but an existential threat. The speeches of Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels repeated the idea that the war would only end when Europe was free of Jews. This rhetoric, far from being empty propaganda, served as a conceptual framework to legitimize the most extreme. The idea of a race war became a central element of the Nazi narrative. According to this vision, no he was trying only of gained territories, but of purify to the continent from what they considered a biological threat. This logic inevitably led to extermination as the only definitive solution. Before the Conference of Wannsee in January of 1942, already there was a consensus in the regime's ruling circles. The elimination of the Jews was a necessity. The first extermination camps began to operate in the east, such as Chelmno, where gas trucks were used to murder prisoners. The experience accumulated in mass shooting campaigns served as a basis for an industrialization of murder. The need for greater efficiency led to the construction of permanent facilities with gas chambers and crematoria, the final solution. It was not born from a single decree, but from an accumulation of decisions, practices, and justifications that converged on a single objective. The Wannsee meeting was not the starting point of the genocide, but a moment of coordination between different state agencies to put into practice what had already been was doing in different forms. The bases ideological, the method's initials of extermination, and the administrative machinery was already in operation. Wannsee served to confirm and formalize a process that had been developing for almost a decade, from initial marginalization to physical elimination. The road to extermination was progressive, bureaucratic, and deliberate, without the need for great public speeches, but with a chilling effectiveness. The transformation of anti-Semitism into state policy found in this conference its clearest expression. Heydrich and he path toward Wannsee, he architect of the coordination. Reinhard Heydrich was appointed in September 1939 as head of the newly created Reich Main Security Office, known by its acronym RSHA. This entity merged the Gestapo, the SD, and the Criminal Polizei, allowing for an unprecedented centralization of the regime's repressive apparatus. Formally under the command of Heinrich Himmler, but operationally in the hands of Heydrich, the RSHA became the decisive nucleus of the security apparatus, persecution racial of the National Socialism. From his headquarters in Berlin, Heydrich consolidated a bureaucratic network charged with gathering intelligence on the Jewish population, designing segregation policies, coordinating deportations, and directing selective extermination operations in the occupied territories. Throughout the first years of the war, the ghettoization system, permanent surveillance, organization of transportation and subsequent physical elimination were coordinated from his office with sustained administrative efficiency. Heydrich gained power as the war intensified, and in the summer of 1941 he received a direct order from Hermann Göring that formalized its role as the main executor of the final solution question being. The letter, dated on July 31st of that year, he granted him authority for design and coordinate all the mechanisms necessary for the implementation of the plan in collaboration with other state entities. With this legal basis, Heydrich assumed operational leadership of the extermination and began planning a meeting to unify institutional efforts around that objective. The idea was to consolidate interministerial support and cooperation around a policy already underway in the Eastern Territories, where special units under SS control were already carrying to Cape executions massive after the invasion of the Soviet Union. During the autumn of 1941, Heydrich devoted himself to preparing a conference with key representatives of the political, legal, and administrative apparatus of the Reich. The purpose was twofold: to inform about the central guidelines of the plan and ensure the cooperation of all the institutions involved. Aware that this was an operation of enormous scale and consequences, Heydrich opted for a closed, controlled, and administrative-style format. He chose as the meeting place a villa confiscated from the Jewish businessman Friedrich Minot, located at 56-58 Am Großen Wannsee, on the outskirts of Berlin. The place offered privacy, tranquility, and symbolism. A luxurious space in a secluded setting where the most lethal decisions could be discussed with bureaucratic calm. The selection of the villa was not accidental, but part of an organizational style that avoided internal political tensions through a scenography of technical professionalism. The tone of the event was to be informal, yet direct. Heydrich prepared the invitations well in advance and sent drafts of the program to his closest collaborators. The intention was not to debate the meaning of the plan, but to present his implementation as a guideline already agreed upon at the highest level. Selected attendees included representatives from the ministries of the Interior, Justice, Foreign Affairs, the Eastern Administration, and various branches of the SS. The goal was for everyone to understand their specific role in the operation without questioning the overall framework. The villa was set up to the meeting in the first days of December, but due to setbacks arising from the military situation and of the entrance in war of states joined, the date original was postponed. The meeting was finally held on January 20th, 1942. Heydrich ensured that the meeting had no public or political character. Each guest received precise instructions and was selected for their ability to make operational decisions on behalf of their institution. The language used in the invitations was carefully calibrated. They spoke of coordination and solution joint, avoiding explicit terms that might anticipate the real content of the meeting. This strategy reflected Heydrich's style, controlling the process without provoking unnecessary resistance, advancing through tacit agreements, and hiding the most lethal decisions under a technical veneer. Even within the regime, Heydrich avoided speeches ideological when no were functional. He preferred concrete procedures, clear timelines, and well-defined hierarchical structures. The format of the meeting in Wannsee reflected this logic. An opening presentation by of Hussein followed of interventions brief, without extensive deliberations or substantive questioning. Preparation for the event also included drafting supporting documents and a bill official, task that was confident to Adolf Eichmann, subordinate straight Heydrich's, and in charge of the logistics of the plan. Eichmann Job in contact narrow with the organizing team and prepared materials that would be presented to the attendees as basis for discussion. These documents contained detailed figures, administrative definitions, and criteria for classifying Jews by racial categories, elements key to the subsequent preparation of the minutes of the meeting. The content of these materials already anticipated that the objective was not to discuss whether I had to be carried out the deportation and elimination, but how it should be organized, who would be in charge of each phase, and that mechanisms, legal, administrative, and logistical resources would be employed. Heydrich, as head of the RSHA and delegate to Himmler and Göring, operated at a strategic point in the Nazi system. His ability to combine brutality with technical rationality made him the ideal executor of a policy that depended on both fanaticism and efficiency. Under his leadership, the extermination apparatus was endowed with appearance legal, of structure rational, and of language administrative. The meeting of Wannsee was conceived by him as one more stage in a chain of decisions already taken, in the only thing missing was to coordinate the collaboration of the rest of the apparatus state. His speech during the meeting he left clear that the elimination physics of the Jews already there was started in he this, and that the challenge was to extend that model to the whole of Europe. The act was not a deliberation but a formalization. Heydrich was not asking for permission but for collaboration. The figure of Heydrich synthesized the core of the genocidal project, a combination of racial ideology, police dominance, and bureaucratic rationality. It was not a fanatic chaotic, neither a passive follower of orders, but a meticulous organizer, convinced that extermination was a necessary technical and political task. His death, which occurred a few months later due to an attack in Prague, interrupted his direct role, but the coordination model he established at Wannsee remained in force. The meeting he designed, led and controlled represented the institutionalization full of the solution end. No as a series of isolated crimes, but as a policy of state orchestrated from his center same of power. The villa, the attendees, the documents and tone of the meeting reflected his imprint. Precision, concealment, hierarchy and death turned into a procedure. The villa and the list, who decided the death of 11 million. On the outskirts of southwest Berlin, on the banks of the Lake Wannsee, he finds an elegant mansion surrounded by gardens and private docks. This building was selected as the venue for a meeting that would change European history. It was not chosen by chance. The tranquility of the surroundings and its character reserved offered he place perfect for a conversation of high-level officials of the state and security apparatus of the Third Reich. The villa had been requisitioned by the SS and was under control administrative of the Service of Security. Its location allowed attendees to arrive quickly from central Berlin without being exposed to the hustle and bustle or outside gazes. On January 20th, 1942, 15 men met there to coordinate the technical and administrative aspects of the planned extermination of the entire European Jewish population. They were not low-ranking bureaucrats, neither technicians operatives without can of decision. These were key figures in the machinery of the Nazi state. Representatives of ministries, police agencies, legal directorates and departments in charge of international relations were present, all formally summoned by the head of the RSHA, Reinhard Heydrich. The event was neither public nor advertised as a state meeting, nor did it leave any immediately visible traces. However, it sealed an operational alliance between different spheres of power that paved the way for a systematic policy of mass murder. The 15 participants were carefully selected to ensure full institutional coverage of the operation. Senior officials from the Ministry of the Interior were present, such as Friedrich Wilhelm Kritzinger, Secretary of State and liaison with the Reich Chancellery. Also in attendance were jurists such as Roland Freisler, Secretary of State in the Ministry of Justice, who would later preside over political trials. In he Volksgerichtshof. From the Ministry of Foreign Affairs came Martin Luther, an intermediate figure but close to Ribbentrop, and with strong interest in the policy regard to the Jews deportees from Allied or neutral countries. From the Reich Ministry of the Interior, representing the administration of population and citizenship, Wilhelm participated Stockart, one of the authors intellectuals of the law's Nuremberg racial protests. Their presence provided the legal framework for justifying, at least formally, the extreme measures discussed. High-ranking figures from the SS and the police apparatus were present. Reinhard Heydrich presided over the session. Adolf Eichmann acted as secretary, responsible for drafting the minutes. Also present were Otto Hoffmann, head of the Central Office for Race and Resettlement, Russia, and Gerhard Klopfer of the party chancellery, who was responsible for coordinating racial policies with local NSDAP authorities. From the administrative apparatus of the general government in Poland, Josef Bühler, Hans Frank's right-hand man, attended. He advocated for accelerating deportations to the occupied territories in the east. Ernst von Neurath, governor of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, sent Rudolf Lange, SS commander in Latvia and responsible for thousands of executions, as a delegate. Georg Leibrandt and Alfred Meyer represented the Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, headed by Alfred Rosenberg. Both supported ethnic cleansing operations in recently captured Soviet regions. Other participants, such as Karl Eberhard Schöngarth, SS officer and head of the SD in the general government, and Heinrich Müller, leader of the Gestapo, guaranteed he control operational and repressive. No one present raised any substantive objections during the meeting. Technical issues, interagency responsibilities, and logistics were discussed. Process. Together, these 15 people represented a condensed representation of Nazi power, from the jurists who interpreted the law to the agents who carried out the orders. The document distributed during the meeting included a detailed list of the estimated Jewish populations in each European country, totaling 11 million people. This figure was not limited to territories under occupation direct. It included also countries neutrals, allies, or even outside German control. The continental scope of the plan required bureaucratic coordination without precedence. Each institution had a role that play. Each name on the list represented a link in the chain of death. The vertical structure of obedience ensured that, after that meeting, the instructions could be quickly translated into systematic action. The location, the selection of attendees, and the manner in which the conference was conducted reflect an essential characteristic of the Holocaust: the normalization of murder in mass through state mechanisms. It was not a decision made by a clandestine group, but a policy agreed upon between ministries with stamps officers and grades formal. The villa, the Wannsee, was not simply a place of passage. It became a symbol of how modern bureaucracy can be transformed into an instrument of collective extermination. The machinery, legal, decrees, orders, and legitimations of the barbarism. The process that led to the mass extermination of European Jews did not take place in a legal vacuum or outside the structure of the Nazi state. Each step was carefully enshrined in legal forms, ministerial decrees, administrative resolutions, and internal circulars that sought to confer formal legitimacy on what was, in essence, a policy of annihilation. Regime, I understood that I had to express yourself through of the language of the legality, even that legality served for structure crime. Since Hitler's rise to power, the German legal system was modified to adapt to the ideological goals of National Socialism. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 marked a turning point, redefining German citizenship and prohibiting marriages between Jews and non-Jews. This legislation was introduced as a defense of purity racial, but in the practice constituted a basis legal for exclude to millions of people from the civic network. To leave of so, the Jews they left of be considered full members of the national community, paving the way for more radical measures. The Nazi legal apparatus operated through a combination of formal laws, Führer decrees, and ministerial orders, and decisions administrative that they had force regulations. This diversity of instruments allowed for rapid action and adaptation to changing situations without requiring parliamentary approval. As the war progressed, anti-Jewish measures intensified, justified under the pretext of internal security, collaboration with the enemy, or social cleansing. Each new restriction was accompanied by a written regulation, which assigned responsibilities and delimited powers. The Ministry of the Interior, under Wilhelm Frick and later under Heinrich Himmler as Reichsführer SS, played a key role in this structure. Through its departments of administration, police and matters racial issued circulars that regulated the evacuation, deportation, either lockdown of the Jews. Our orders, they transmitted to regional governments, police stations and local administrations, which were to implement them following precise instructions. The language used was deliberately technical, with terms like transfer, resettlement, or final solution, which obscured the true meaning of the actions. The regime's jurists elaborated detailed justifications for each stage of the process. Exclusion from the education system, expropriation of properties, the loss of labor rights, or the imposition of forced labor were protected by regulations and provisions signed by high-ranking officials. In many cases, these were creative reinterpretations of civil or criminal law adapted to Nazi ideology. The concept of Volksgemeinschaft, or community of the people, served as criterion for decide who could stay and who should be eliminated. The Gestapo, as political police, had authority legal for act without intervention judicial. Its actions were protected by special decrees that exempted it from parliamentary control or legal review. This autonomous power was consolidated with the decree of February 28, 1933, which suspended fundamental rights and allowed detention without trial. From then on, legality ceased to be a guarantee and became a tool of terror. In the context of the final solution, jurists had to decide how to deal with the Jewish population in the various occupied territories. In the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, in the General Government of Poland, and in the Baltic or Balkan countries, the rules varied, but the starting point was always the same principle of that the Jews know they had rights. Courts were organized special, censuses forced, and records mandatory for prepare the deportations. Everything was justified with legal arguments and in the name of public order. One of the most representative documents of this criminal legality was the minutes of the Wannsee Conference, drafted by Adolf Eichmann. Although formulated in an administrative tone, these minutes reflect the intention of applying legal measures to resolve the Jewish problem in Europe. The transfer of millions of people to fields working in the East, where they would die of natural reduction, according to the report. Even the exceptions provided for, such as cases of mixed marriages or essential workers, were treated with specific legal criteria, which would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Decrees signed by Himmler and other high-ranking officials detailed procedures for the treatment of abandoned property, the allocation of expropriated housing, and the use of confiscated goods. Companies also had to adhere to specific rules for replacing Jewish labor with German workers or prisoners of war. Everything was recorded, regulated, and supervised by committees created for that purpose. The legality of the extermination was constructed as a dense network of technical provisions where each instance had a defined and documented role. Even in the most advanced stages of the genocide, when extermination centers such as Belzec, Sobibor, or Treblinka were already operating, the documents inmates followed, referring to the victims in administrative terms. The orders of transport, the lists of names and instructions for railway authorities were part of the same legal framework, the appearance of procedure regular. The efficiency bureaucratic, it was one of the pillars that allowed for the swift and coordinated execution of mass murder. The role of the regime's jurists was not passive. Many of them not only applied the regulations but also actively collaborated in their design. They transformed ideology into law, adapting legal principles, Germans to the demands of the Third Reich. This transformation was not imposed by force, but accepted and promoted by great part of the legal apparatus. The voluntary participation of lawyers, prosecutors, and judges was essential to building a normative structure consistent with the objectives of extermination. Nazi legality was not a mask improvised, was a tool deliberate and effective that allowed that millions of people were excluded, deported, and murdered without that the device state would leave of be considered tidy and rational. The barbarism he coded in decrees, it was sealed with official signatures and executed with forms and stamps. The crime was transformed into an administrative procedure. He calculation fatal, 11 million Jews low threat. During the Wannsee meeting, one of the figures that most shocked the audience was the estimated total number of Jews in Europe, 11 million. That addition, it did not emerge in an improvised manner, but was the result of prior work of compilation, classification, and demographic analysis carried out by Adolf Eichmann's office. The list presented reflected not only the amount of people that lived in the territories under the control of the Third Reich, but also in those areas still by conquer. The map of persecution had no fixed geographical boundaries. It ranged from Western countries, such as France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, to the easternmost reaches of Europe, including regions of the Soviet Union that were still in conflict. Also included were Jews from the Balkans, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, Hungary, Romania, and even Turkey, although the latter country was not yet part of the direct theatre of war. Figures were even mentioned for neutral or no-busy, such as Switzerland, Ireland, Spain, Sweden, and Great Britain. For each of these locations, the list indicated a precise number of individuals who were to be treated according to the administrative language used at the meeting. Eichmann was in charge of reading this document to those present. The list was organized by country and detailed with accuracy the amount of Jews that lived in each one of them. France, by example, appeared with a round of 800,000. The countries low with more than 150,000, and Germany, including Austria and the Sudetenland, with more than 130,000. The total figure amounted to more than 11 million people, divided by nationality, area of residence, and in some cases by degree of miscegenation according to the racial laws of the time. The inclusion of Mischlinge, people of partial Jewish descent, was also part of the calculation, although their specific fate still had to be discussed at other levels. This classification reflected not only a policy of physical extermination, but also a project of depuration racial thorough. No HE was trying to eliminate political enemies or dangerous individuals, but to delete all fingerprint biological that challenged the purity of the Volksgemeinschaft, the supposed German ethnic community. The document read by Eichmann served also as base technique for the execution of the final solution. These numbers allowed for estimates of the number of trains needed, the logistical resources required, and the capacity of the extermination camps. Each number represented a specific operation, a deportation schedule, a number of barracks and gas chambers that were to be built or expanded. Eichmann's role was not just that of a bureaucrat organizing papers, but that of a central operator that connected political decisions with physical structures of death. By presenting these statistics, it not only showed the magnitude of the project, but legitimized its implementation by giving it a technical and rational appearance. The meeting at Wannsee was not a place of debate about whether it should be done, but about how to do it most effectively. The statistic of 11 million was not a symbolic number. It was a roadmap. One of the aspects that further calls the attention of the list presented is that many of the countries mentioned still were low-control German. Without embargo, were included as, its conquest was an imminent event. This detail reveals that the final solution was not an improvised reaction to the escalating conflict, but a structured plan with continental ambitions. The inclusion of British or Spanish Jews in he counting it was not a mistake, but an implicit declaration that if the war spread, they too would be targeted by the extermination apparatus. The persecution responded not only to criteria of military security or territorial occupation, but to an ideological logic that admitted no exceptions. For those who participated in Wannsee, the existence of Jews anywhere in Europe was a problem that had to be resolved definitively. The presentation of these figures also had a persuasive purpose. By showing the scale of the challenge, Heydrich and his collaborators sought to generate a sense of urgency among the ministries present. The problem was not small, neither local. He was trying of millions of people distributed in dozens of jurisdictions under different laws with different citizenships. Heydrich's goal was for all institutions involved to understand that complete coordination was needed, without obstacles or delays. The massive nature of the plan justified, in the eyes of the organizers, the need for acting with exceptional procedures outside the usual legal framework. In this context, the figure of 11 million was also an argument to centralize decisions, reduce paperwork, and speed up processes. In addition to the numerical impact, the list had a content symbolic. It showed the desire to control every aspect of life and death of an entire population. No, it didn't matter whether someone lived in Paris or in a village in eastern Poland. His origin family fit into the enemy categories was in the sights of the state apparatus. The classification by country, which might seem like a simple technical tool, was in reality an instrument of dehumanization. Each number displaced people from their true identity to a statistical position, thus facilitating their disappearance within an operation presented as necessary, inevitable, and rational. The total figure in its coldness concealed the deliberate and planned nature of the crime. The use of these demographic data also allowed for progress in interministerial coordination. Each number implied a network of shared responsibilities. The Ministry of the Interior was to collaborate to define who was considered Jewish. The Ministry of Justice was to ensure that racial provisions were respected. The Ministry of Transport was to facilitate transfers. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was to negotiate with allied or puppet governments to implement the corresponding policies. The list of 11 millions was only a photograph of the present, but a scheme operational for the months and years following. Each line of the document represented a decision that had to be executed by some office, some official, some department. The implication was not vague, but precise. The final sum, read aloud, hit a stage of preparation and gave way to a machinery that no longer had reverse gear. The machine of the extermination, coordination ministerial and operational. No new laws were drafted or direct orders signed at the Wannsee Conference. However, a practical consensus was reached that sealed cooperation between various organisms, state, military, and police. The language used was, it was technical, deliberately ambiguous, and avoided direct references to the murder. Yet all participants clearly understood what was expected of them. The tacit commitment was to eliminate any bureaucratic barriers. That could hinder the deportation and physical elimination of the Jewish population. For achieve that aim was essential to establish an effective collaborative network between the various branches of the administration. Heydrich used the meeting as a space to reaffirm his leadership in the policy racial. Although no technical details were discussed regarding fields, either executions, was left established that the Reich Main Security Office, which he directed, I would be the entity charged with coordinating the entire operation. Representatives of the ministries of justice, interior, foreign affairs, transportation, and others accepted this hierarchical structure. Instead of friction, there were explicit provisions for support. Everyone knew that the elimination of the Jews required total synchronization. Trains on precise schedules, legal forms, population registers, and relentless logistics ranging from identification to final destination in the extermination centers. The Ministry of the Interior played a pivotal role. Its responsibility was no small one. It was to provide the necessary data to locate Jews within the territory of the Reich, including those married to non-Jews, temporarily exempted, or persons of mixed status. It was also to harmonize racial definitions and apply regulations that would clearly identify the targets of the operation. Without these updated and accurate records, the administrative machinery could not function. At the same time, it had to coordinate with local authorities to prepare the deportations without generating resistance among the German population. Discretion and the appearance of legality were essential to maintain social stability while the plan was carried out. The Ministry of Transport had an equally crucial task. Mass deportations required carriages, stations, timetables, and routes free of interferences. No HE was trying a few transfers. The figure of 11 million required continuous train circulation for months. For this, specific resources had to be reserved, even in the midst of war, when the system railway was crowded by needs military. He simple made that these movements were given priority demonstrates the centrality that there was acquired the final solution was on the regime's agenda. The efficiency with which the transfers to the east were organized reflects fine-tuned logistical collaboration where each link in the chain knew exactly what to do and when. For its part, the Ministry of Justice had to watch by the adequacy of all our measures to current regulations. The goal was not to achieve full legality, but rather to provide regulatory coverage that would allow officials to act without fear of sanctions. The jurists Nazis developed regulations, decrees, and opinions that made possible the expropriation, loss of citizenship, and internment forced. In cases of marriages mixed, minor cases, or specific exceptions, formulas were provided so that the judicial system could resolve situations without hindering the overall progress of the plan. The aim was to eliminate any legal uncertainty that could generate delays or internal disputes. The system had to operate with complete confidence that everything was protected by the law, even if it had been adapted to facilitate the crime. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs had a diplomatic function clue. Know all the Jews resided in areas low control straight of the Third Reich. For implement the solution final in allied or dependent territories such as Slovakia, Croatia, or Romania, it was necessary to negotiate with their respective governments. Furthermore, they had to influence neutral or unoccupied states to ensure that they did not offer refuge or facilitate escape routes. The language used in diplomatic communications was similarly coded. They spoke of relocations or special measures, but the objective was always the same. The Nazi embassies, they converted in nodes news that monitored whereabouts of Jewish communities in Europe and pressed for that submit to the established procedures. Within the police apparatus, the Reich Main Security Office was the nerve center. This structure integrated the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the party security service. Under the direction of Heydrich and, after his assassination, Heinrich Himmler, this entity directed practical operations in the occupied territories. The mobile units, known as Einsatzgruppen, already had developed a lethal experience in the eastern countries, executing hundreds of thousands of people through mass shootings. The accumulated experience was later transferred to a more industrial system with camps such as Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz. The police of the order, including battalions such as the 101st, was integrated into the tasks of custody, surveillance, and liquidation. Each branch had specific functions, but all responded to a common logic: to carry out the extermination without fail. The civil governors in the occupied territories were also included in this network. Their role was to collaborate with the security forces, guarantee the supply of slave labor when deemed useful, and then facilitate deportations. In some cases, they attempted to preserve certain exceptions, especially in the initial phases of the process, but as the central structure imposed their guidelines, these local resistances dissolved. Pressure from Berlin was constant, and those who did not cooperate could be replaced or marginalized. The principle of hierarchical obedience was maintained even abroad. The chain of command operated with military precision. A particular aspect of this coordination was the dimension temporary. To leave of Wannsee, the extermination schedule became more systematic. The phases were distributed by region, by waves, and by specific conditions. In Hedis, the action was immediate. In the West, progress was made in stages, seeking to avoid tensions diplomatic with countries like France or Italy. In the center of the Reich, he regulated the marriages mixed and the war privileges to determine who should go first. The machinery was adjusted according to political, logistical, and diplomatic conditions. There was no improvisation. Every decision was evaluated against the final objective. The minutes of the meeting did not order killing, but in his structure, in their definitions, in their commitments, the collaboration map was drawn that would do possible genocide. There were no objections. No one withdrew. No one raised moral obstacles, either legal. All those present understood that they were participating in an enterprise of annihilation and assumed their role within it. That pact, silent between ministries, offices, police officers, and the diplomats needed no further words. The apparatus was ready, and all that remained was to execute it with the bureaucratic coldness that had characterized the entire regime. Eichmann, the logistics of kill. During the years prior to the Wannsee Conference, Adolf Eichmann consolidated his profile as a key player in the apparatus of persecution. Income to the HH in the 1930s, and was assigned early to matters Jews inside of the service of security. His work initially focused on surveillance and intelligence gathering on Jewish organizations, but soon evolved into a more operational role. In Vienna, after he Anschluss directed the Office Central for the Emigration Bean, where put in practice administrative methods for force the exit of the population Hebrew. This model He later replied in Prague and Berlin, outlining Eichmann as the main technician of the organized expulsion. Under the authority of Reinhard Heydrich, Eichmann was promoted inside of the Department 4B4 of the RSHA, specifically responsible for Jewish affairs and evacuation. Its responsibility included coordinating measures to gather, concentrate, and deport Jews. It maintained direct contact with the Reich transport authorities, with the police commanders in the occupied territories, and with representatives of the Ministry of the Interior. In the months prior to the Wannsee meeting, there was participated in deportations from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia toward her ghetto of Lodz and other towns in the general government. He also participated in the first mass shootings in the East, collaborating with the Einsatzgruppen leaders in the regions conquered by the Wehrmacht. During the preparations for the conference, Eichmann acted as Heydrich's executive arm. He was responsible for drafting the reports, compiling data, and organizing the conferences, demographics, and ensure communication with the various institutions involved. His office was the one that calculated and structured the list of European Jews by country that would later be presented at the meeting, with exact figures that included territories not yet conquered. Eichmann oversaw the logistics of the call. He occupied of the impression of the documents and of the distribution of the minutes after the meeting. After the meeting, he was ordered to implement the agreements adopted in Wannsee, and he did so without deviating from his technical and administrative role. His function focused on the systematic organization of the trains that transported deportees from the cities to the extermination camps. He coordinated with the Deutsche Reichsbahn the availability of wagons, the assignment of routes and schedules, and the notification to local authorities for the collection of individuals. He personally oversaw the details of each convoy, including the number of deportees, the point of departure, the final destination, and the estimated journey time. The implementation of transport to Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and later Auschwitz was managed. Low his direct supervision. This work required constant contact with camp managers who reported on available capacity, logistical needs, and deadlines for receiving new human shipments. Eichmann maintained a functional relationship with Heydrich until his death in 1942, and then became directly dependent on Heinrich Himmler. Although his position did not imply hierarchical authority over other departments, his technical role gave him absolute control over the deportation process. He answered to the higher directives and the translated in schedules, forms, orders of transport, and multilateral coordination. Despite their low formal rank, their decisions directly affected the fate of millions of people. His style, characterized by his adherence to procedure, neutrality in execution, and absence of moral questioning in their actions. During the deportations from France, Holland, Belgium, Greece, and other countries, his department maintained constant correspondence with SS representatives abroad, ensuring that arrests, gatherings, and embarkations met the stipulated deadlines. When emerged issues in the routes, either delays in the convoys, intervening to readjust the schedule or reallocate resources. He also collaborated in the establishment of transit points such as Drancy, Mechelen, and Westerbork, from where Jews were sent to the camps in the east. His stake, he limited to the transport, but rather encompassed also the documentation legal that authorized the deportations, the agreements with government's allies, either collaborators, and the systematic reporting of figures to his superiors. Eichmann carried out his task without presenting himself as the author of a policy, but rather as its meticulous executor. He did not draft supreme orders or propose extermination, but he was responsible for ensuring that every technical step ran smoothly. He prepared statistical reports, updated lists, and ensured that the flows of population coincided with the capacity of the killing centers. His mastery of detail, his documentary style, and his adherence to administrative order made him an irreplaceable cog in the machinery of the final solution. Of Wannsee to Auschwitz, the execution of the solution final. After the Wannsee meeting, the deportation system of the Jews Europeans, accelerated and was structured in well-defined phases. The machinery administrative and operational putting. The responsibility for the death was transferred to a chain of decisions, orders, and executions that unfolded methodically. The first stage was concentration. The ghettos established in Polish cities such as Warsaw, Łódź, and Krakow became depots. Humans where he secluded to communities whole to the weight of his transfer. Our areas closed, guarded, and monitored served as starting point for mass transports managed by the Reich authorities. From the beginning of 1942, freight trains were organized to transport people from the ghettos to the extermination camps. The Main Security Office of the Reich, low the supervision of Adolf Eichmann, coordinated the movements of thousands of people a day. Each convoy required detailed planning, from requesting wagons from German railways to coordinating with local authorities who had to prepare to the deported. In many cases, he included a pre-selection. Elderly people, young children, and those unable to work were sent in the first batches, prioritizing their immediate elimination upon arrival. The Chelmno camp began operating in December 1941, before of the conference, but was after that his use systematized. In the following weeks they put in operation Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, all they designed exclusively for the physical elimination of deportees. Unlike Auschwitz, these centers did not comply functions labor, but that were conceived as final destinations. The victims were conducted directly from the wagons toward the cameras of gas, and the bodies were cremated or buried in mass graves. The constant flow of trains required an organization that avoided interruptions, so regional quotas were established for the occupied countries, including the countries France, Belgium, Slovakia, and Greece. The collaboration of allied or puppet governments of the Reich was key. In Slovakia, deportations began in March 1942 with the help of the local government. In France, the French police actively cooperated in the raids. In the Netherlands, the records civilians and the efficiency bureaucratic facilitated the ID of the Jews. Each state or regional administration participated with various degrees of involvement, but always under the general coordination of the SS. Transit points were created, such as Drancy in France, either Westerbork in the country's Low, where the deportees were grouped together before being sent to the camps in Poland. The process number was immediate, neither homogeneous. Some regions, as Hungary, maintained its Jewish population without deportation until 1944. But even in those cases, once the decision was made, the operation was carried out Cape with speed extreme. In just a few weeks, hundreds of thousands of people were transported in inhumane conditions toward his death. In many trains, no heat provided water, neither food, and the doors remained closed for days. Upon arrival, the selection was swift. Women, the elderly, and children were sent directly to the gas chambers. Young men were destined for jobs forced, although the most would die in conditions extreme in the following months. Internal records show that those in charge of transport, they should ensure a constant flow without delays. The German railway system does not only maintain the trains' military and supplies, but also had to reserve space for these convoys. The Deutsche Reichsbahn billed the transport of Jews as if it were ordinary freight, calculating rates by distance and number of people. This detail highlights the level of bureaucratic standardization that the extermination. No HE was trying of operations secret activities outside the state system, but rather activities integrated into its daily functioning. In the reports sent to Berlin from the areas of occupation, the officers' officials detailed the number of deportees, their departure dates and arrival, and the state of the convoys. The regularity of these reports allowed the central authorities to adjust the routes, plan new actions, and resolve logistical bottlenecks. In parallel, he maintained the public discourse of relocation to the east, while rumors about what was really happening spread among the deportees themselves. However, misinformation and fear made it difficult any endurance organized. Some testimonies indicate even when they boarded the trains, many thought they were going to work in another region, not an extermination center. Auschwitz-Birkenau HE converted in HE major destination of the transportation massive to Lviv of 1943. Its extermination capacity and the combination of forced labor with immediate elimination made it the core of the most industrial phase of the process. Convoys from all over Europe were received there. The selection ramp, the cameras, gas furnaces, and crematoria were in continuous operation. Sonderkommandos, groups of prisoners forced to assist in the process, were used to move bodies and clean the facilities. His existence sampled the level of control absolute that was carried out in the countryside and the degree of dehumanization reached. The use of ghettos was decreasing extent that they emptied. In some cases, like the Warsaw Ghetto, riots broke out in response to the announcement of new deportations. The response was violent and decisive. The remaining ghettos were liquidated, their inhabitants relocated or murdered on the spot. The final phase of the extermination process no longer required these urban concentrations. All his system he oriented toward the total disappearance of Jewish communities through direct transportation to murder. The result was a network of extermination that spanned all of Europe. From Lisbon to Kharkiv, from Oslo to Thessaloniki, trains traveled thousands of kilometers loaded with people. The Wannsee meeting was not a starting point but a key step in the consolidation of a structure that was already operating. But it was from then on that the extermination became in a policy of state completely coordinated. Language, technical discipline, division of labor, and administrative efficiency concealed crime under a veneer of order. Millions of people were transported like merchandise to centers where death was the only intended destination. Every ghetto, every train, every civil servant, and every signature on a document were part of a chain that he took to Cape. He made a further systematic review of modern history. The missing necessary, the silence of Hitler and the absence of Himmler. On the morning of January 20th, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich opened the Wannsee Conference without Adolf Hitler's name appearing in the call or in the official transcript of the proceedings. The leader of the regime, was there, but his presence was felt in every sentence and every proposal. The extermination apparatus was already working in the Eastern Territories, and that morning's meeting had as purpose of fine-tuning technical coordination. However, Hitler's formal absence was deliberate. No written order, no signature, No explicit speech clearly endorsed the policy of total extermination, but all those present knew that this was the highest mandate. The strategy of no-leave constancy direct of the decisions further compromising no was new. From the beginning of the conflict, Hitler's entourage operated through a logic of proactive interpretation of his wishes. A general phrase in conversation or an indirect allusion was enough to prompt his subordinates to take extreme measures. This calculated ambiguity created a system of distributed responsibility where each level carried out lethal actions without official instruction. At Wannsee, Heydrich presented himself as authoritative. By he Führer followed the solution end, but contributed no specific document or order. Himmler was not present at the lakeside villa either. As Reichsführer SS, he had consolidated the police apparatus, aimed at the Einsatzgruppen, and controlled the concentration camps. His absence followed the same pattern, maintaining operational distance from the details of logistics, while delegating the direct organization of the genocide. Without embargo, the role of Himmler in the extermination was central. From the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the mobile units under his command executed to hundreds of thousands of people in the conquered areas. The leap from repression to systematic annihilation had already taken place months before the conference. Heydrich was the visible face of a program that required multiple levels of collaboration. Their mission was to formalize a bureaucratic consensus to eliminate all Jews from Europe. Himmler's absence at Wannsee did not imply disinterest, but rather a maneuver for consolidate his own position as executor indirect. In the months before, had held meetings with Hitler in they argued topics linked to resettlement, security in the occupied territories, and the Jewish problem, although no source provides written evidence of specific decisions. System. It operated through the free interpretation of the expectations of the leadership. Hitler's words in various contexts served as an ideological basis for justifying radicalization. In several internal speeches, he repeatedly stated that Jews were those responsible for the war and that their elimination was a necessity for national survival. These expressions were not operational orders, but functioned as guides for action. Subordinates competed with each other to demonstrate initiative in implementing these ideas. In this climate of anticipated obedience, the lack of concrete instructions was not a weakness of the system, but its essential mechanism. At Wannsee, the participants acted as cogs within this faceless structure. The legitimacy of the meeting was based in an authorization verbal attributed to Hitler. Without that, there was any record of it. This pattern allowed for the claim of ignorance or overzealousness on the part of lower levels in a future trial. Both Hitler and Himmler was left out of the record, but his decisions were embedded in every phrase and each agreement. The legal engineering of the conference consisted of designing a policy of collective murder without mentioning murder. Hitler's silence allowed the regime to maneuver effectively before the international community. Nazi propaganda spoke of deportations, resettlements, and forced labor, always avoiding the term extermination. This strategy concealed reality, while the gas chambers they multiplied in fields as Chelmno, Belzec, either Sobibor. The operating model did not require explicit directives, but rather a network of subordinates aligned with a shared vision. Himmler, from his position, was responsible for that each piece of the system functioned without the need for public exposure. The subsequent statement by Adolf Eichmann, already captured by Israel, would confirm this dynamic. In his words, all initiatives were taken with the conviction of fulfilling the will of the higher authorities, even though there was never a signed order from Hitler. This structural ambiguity allowed the High Command to maintain an apparent distance from the crime, while their subordinates assumed practical responsibility. The design of the genocide rested on this invisible distribution of functions and silences. Hitler and Himmler's non-attendance at Wannsee also reflected a symbolic hierarchy. The meeting was intended for middle and high-ranking officials, not for the top leaders. It was a meeting technical, no political in they argued procedures, railway routes, legal definitions, and degrees of miscegenation. The architecture of the crime must have seemed to be the result of an administrative necessity, not a desire for extermination. Hitler and Himmler were part of that setup. Throughout the war, Hitler would maintain that line. He did not visit the extermination camps or sign decrees on mass murder. His leadership operated from ambiguity and dogma, leaving figures as Himmler, Heydrich, either Goebbels will apply the measures with tactical independence. In this framework, Wannsee was a decisive step, not because of its dramatic nature, but because of its technical nature. The annihilation was already underway. The conference simply articulated the legal, logistical, and semantic machinery to carry it out without leaving any direct traces.